On the morning of January 7, 1945, in the middle of the bitter European winter during World War II, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery walked into a packed press conference in Zonhoven, Belgium, only weeks after the German Ardennes offensive, better known as the Battle of the Bulge, had shaken Allied confidence and tested the fragile working relationship between British and American high command. The date and hour mattered because what unfolded in that press briefing would ripple through the Allied coalition, influencing command relationships, reputations, and strategic trust in the critical final phase of World War II. Montgomery saw this briefing as an opportunity to clarify his role in stabilizing the northern flank of the Ardennes during the crisis and to reinforce his image as a steady strategic thinker. But to many American leaders, especially General Omar Bradley and General Dwight D. Eisenhower, it appeared instead as a personal publicity display, an unnecessary ego-driven attempt to portray himself as the savior of the Allied effort. Understanding why this moment became so controversial requires stepping back into the political, military, and personal dynamics shaping the late war campaign in Western Europe, and how Montgomery's carefully stage-managed public narrative collided with the tense realities of coalition warfare. To appreciate the stakes of that January 1945 press appearance, it is important to remember the context of the Battle of the Bulge itself. In December 1944, at approximately 5:30 a.m. on December 16 of that year, the German army launched a massive surprise offensive across the Ardennes forest, striking thinly defended portions of the American front in Belgium and Luxembourg. This desperate counteroffensive was Adolf Hitler's last major gamble in World War II, intended to split Allied armies, seize Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. The result was shock, confusion, and significant American losses in the first days of the battle. U.S. units such as the 106th Infantry Division were overrun, and towns like Saint-Vith and Clervaux fell under immense pressure. Eisenhower responded rapidly, rushing reserves, authorizing flexible command adjustments, and shifting formations like the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions to key defensive positions. Amid this unfolding crisis, the northern sector of the front, traditionally under American General Omar Bradley, temporarily came under the operational control of Montgomery, who commanded the British 21st Army Group. This transfer was made for practical reasons, largely because German advances disrupted Bradley's ability to communicate and coordinate across his forward headquarters. Eisenhower, responsible for the overall Allied command, believed Montgomery's headquarters structure was better positioned to maintain coherence in the chaotic northern sector. Montgomery now commanded two of the U.S. First Army's corps and played a crucial role in organizing the defensive stand along the northern shoulder of the Bulge. He emphasized deliberate counterattacks, supply control, and avoiding hurried, uncoordinated offensives. Many American commanders viewed his methods as overly cautious, but they also recognized that his sector stabilized and prevented German breakthroughs toward Liege and Namur. By late December and early January, coordinated American counteroffensives from both north and south, alongside improving weather that allowed Allied air power to return to the skis, began reversing German gains. The crisis was turning, yet success created another kind of risk, the question of who would receive credit for halting the offensive and reclaiming lost ground. When Montgomery stepped to the lectern on that January morning, he framed his narrative carefully. During the press conference, he explained that when the American lines broke under German pressure, he had gathered the reins and imposed what he described as calm, methodical leadership on U.S. formations operating under him. He praised American troops personally for their bravery, discipline, and ability to withstand the worst of the German assault. But while his words included compliments, the structure of his remarks implied something deeper, that American leadership had faltered during the crisis and that he had been the decisive figure who restored order and direction. The impression was subtle but unmistakable to his American allies. He described the defensive realignment as though he had assumed near-total responsibility for the northern sector, speaking in sweeping terms about his strategic planning and decision-making. He portrayed events as a kind of vindication of his long-running belief that operations should be tightly controlled, centrally planned, and paced carefully, implicitly contrasting his style with what he often viewed as the more aggressive and decentralized American approach. This public framing clashed directly with American interpretations of the battle. Eisenhower, Brandon of coalition unity, had deliberately presented the Bulge response as a joint Allied success. To him, the battle represented the strength of cooperation among American and British forces, not the stage for individual credit or strategic rivalry. American generals like Bradley and Patton had already felt that Montgomery sometimes criticized U.S. operational culture privately. Now they saw his remarks as public confirmation of those frustrations. While Montgomery saw his conference as clarifying his strategic intent, American commanders interpreted it as a political maneuver, an attempt to preserve his strategic influence within Allied planning at a time when his earlier proposals, especially the advocacy of a single narrow thrust into Germany under British leadership, had largely lost favor. From an educational standpoint, this episode provides a meaningful lesson in how civil-military relations and inter-allied politics shaped strategic outcomes during World War II. Coalition warfare depends not only on battlefield competence, but also on trust, restraint, and diplomatic sensitivity. Montgomery's press approach collided with American expectations about humility and shared credit. His wartime reputation had already been defined by confidence bordering on theatrical presentation, from his carefully choreographed public image in North Africa to his insistence on emphasizing British contributions to Allied victories. Yet in the late war context, where American manpower, production, and logistical dominance were increasingly decisive, this same assertiveness risked appearing out of step with shifting power realities inside the alliance. The reaction to Montgomery's press conference inside Allied High Command was immediate and intense. Eisenhower's staff and senior American commanders expressed frustration, and Bradley in particular regarded the remarks as dismissive of his own staff's role in responding to the crisis. Even though Eisenhower avoided publicly rebuking Montgomery, privately he viewed the briefing as an unnecessary provocation. The friction did not overturn Allied cooperation. Victory remained a shared objective, but it affected how much political space Montgomery would be given in strategic debates during the final campaigns into Germany. The power grab perception did not stem from literal attempts to seize command authority by force, but rather from the sense that Montgomery's public narrative aimed to reinforce his own strategic centrality at a moment when Allied command authority was, in reality, increasingly concentrated in Eisenhower's hands as supreme commander. Historically, it is also important to note that Montgomery was not an outsider or a reckless figure. He was a disciplined planner, a commander who valued preparation and casualty avoidance, and whose earlier victories, such as El Alamein, had been vital to the Allied effort in World War II. But by 1944 and 1945, tensions existed between his strategic philosophy and the broader operational tempo favored by the increasingly powerful U.S. military leadership. His advocacy for a concentrated, single-thrust strategy toward the Ruhr and Berlin often conflicted with Eisenhower's broad front approach, intended to keep German forces stretched across multiple axes. The press conference reignited these strategic disagreements and cast them into the public realm. Rather than appearing as a loyal subordinate emphasizing Allied unity, Montgomery seemed, in American eyes, to be reasserting his long-standing claim to strategic primacy. From a historical education perspective, the controversy serves as a window into the human dimensions of military cooperation. Commanders were not abstract figures. They were individuals shaped by national traditions, personal experiences, and institutional cultures. Montgomery's confidence and blunt communications style resonated with many British officers who admired his clarity and determination. Yet that same style could be perceived as condescending or politically insensitive by American peers. Eisenhower, a skilled coalition manager, spent much of the war balancing egos, national pride, and institutional rivalries. The January 1945 press conference became one of several moments where he was forced to maintain harmony through quiet diplomacy rather than open confrontation. In the aftermath of the conference, Montgomery's strategic influence within Allied decision-making gradually narrowed. He continued to command 21st Army Group and remained integral to operations across the Rhine and into northern Germany, but he was not granted the sweeping operational authority he had sometimes hoped for earlier in the campaign. His power grab did not end through dramatic dismissal or public reprimand, but through a more subtle process of political isolation. Eisenhower increasingly reinforced American command autonomy in their sectors and limited the scope of cross-group command shifts. When subsequent major offensives unfolded, such as Operation Plunder and the Allied crossing of the Rhine, planning remained collaborative, but the narrative context had shifted. Montgomery's credibility among American leaders had been dented, and his press persona was viewed as a liability rather than an asset. Educationally, this episode highlights a broader pattern in the study of World War II. Leaders were constantly negotiating identity, power, and responsibility, even amid life-and-death operations. Historians analyzing the event emphasize that Montgomery's remarks were not merely about self-promotion. They reflected his belief that military leadership required clear and confident public messaging, especially during moments of crisis. Yet modern scholarship also recognizes that coalition warfare requires careful diplomatic calibration, and that strategic communication can be as consequential as troop movements or logistical plans. Montgomery's approach to publicity during and after the Bulge crisis exposed the fragility of Allied unity at precisely the moment when the war in Europe was entering its final and most decisive stage. Looking back, the controversy surrounding Montgomery's press conference underscores how victory in World War II depended on more than operational success on the battlefield. It depended equally on the ability of Allied leaders to sustain trust, manage personality clashes, and maintain a unified public narrative. Montgomery's press ego trip, as it has often been described in historical commentary, did not end his career nor erase his earlier achievements. Instead, it marked the moment when his influence within Allied grand strategy reached its natural limit. The war was shifting, the balance of power inside the coalition was evolving, and the center of strategic gravity was moving firmly into American hands. The controversy that surrounded Montgomery after the January 1945 press conference did not exist in isolation, but emerged from a long and complex evolution of Allied command culture throughout World War II. Understanding why the event resonated so strongly requires examining the years of accumulated perceptions, diplomatic sensitivities, and subtle rivalries that had shaped the relationship between British and American leadership since their earliest cooperation in North Africa. From an educational historical perspective, this period offers an important lens through which students and viewers can better understand how coalition warfare relies not only on shared strategic goals, but also on the ability of commanders to adapt to changing political realities, shifting national strengths, and evolving operational responsibilities. Montgomery had entered the war as one of Britain's most distinctive battlefield personalities. By the time he faced reporters in Belgium in January 1945, his reputation had already been defined by major military milestones such as the Second Battle of El Alamein in 1942, where his careful buildup of force, emphasis on discipline, and insistence on thorough preparation played a decisive role in halting German expansion in North Africa. Within Britain, he was widely viewed as a symbol of resilience and determination at a time when national morale required leaders capable of projecting certainty and resolve. This background shaped both his public persona and his approach to political communication. He believed that strong leadership conveyed confidence and that public acknowledgement of command decisions strengthened rather than weakened morale. However, what worked effectively in a British national context did not always translate smoothly into the more complex environment of multinational cooperation during World War II. By 1944 and 1945, the strategic balance inside the Western Allied coalition had shifted dramatically. The expansion of American industrial production, manpower reserves, and logistical capacity meant that the United States increasingly shouldered the primary burden of offensive operations in Western Europe. Eisenhower, as Supreme Allied Commander, exercised ultimate authority, but his leadership rested on constant diplomatic balancing. He worked to maintain what historians often call coalition equilibrium, the delicate practice of preserving unity among partners who possessed different traditions of command, distinct military cultures, and divergent expectations about how victory should be achieved. In this evolving environment, Montgomery's strong self-identification as a British national commander sometimes clashed unintentionally with the broader cooperative narrative that Eisenhower sought to sustain. Educationally, it is valuable to explore how this tension manifested not simply as personal rivalry, but as an expression of deeper institutional differences. The British Army entered the late stages of World War II with years of exhaustion, limited manpower reserves, and a need to conserve strength carefully. Montgomery's cautious, deliberate style reflected these realities. He believed that high casualties were unacceptable unless absolutely unavoidable, and he preferred to avoid rapid or improvisational offensives that risked being undersupported. American forces, by contrast, operated within a different strategic framework. Their military system allowed for greater flexibility, larger reserves, and a more aggressive operational tempo. Commanders like Patton embodied this dynamic, favoring rapid exploitation and bold maneuvers that sought to collapse German resistance through constant pressure. These contrasting military cultures shaped differing expectations about what constituted success and how it should be communicated publicly. Thus, when Montgomery spoke confidently about his role in stabilizing the northern shoulder of the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, many British observers interpreted his words as simply characteristic of his style, assertive, firm, and grounded, in an effort to clarify command function. Many Americans, however, heard the same statement as an implicit critique of U.S. leadership and a claim of moral or strategic superiority. From a historical education standpoint, this moment illustrates how identical language can produce very different political meanings depending on perspective, national context, and wartime experience. Following the press conference, archival records and personal memoirs reveal a range of reactions among Allied officers. Some British leaders defended Montgomery, arguing that he had been misunderstood or misrepresented by journalists who emphasized the most provocative elements of his speech rather than its full context. Others within the British government quietly acknowledged that the remarks were politically unwise, even if they were not intended as hostile. On the American side, several senior commanders conveyed deep frustration. Bradley felt that his own authority had been eroded in the public eye, while Patton, already skeptical of Montgomery, viewed the incident as confirmation of long-standing suspicions that the British Field Marshal sought public recognition at the expense of Allied cohesion. Eisenhower's response was more measured, reflecting his long-term strategic priorities. He neither issued a dramatic reprimand nor permitted the controversy to escalate into an open diplomatic crisis. Instead, he sought to reduce Montgomery's political leverage by strengthening internal American command autonomy, increasing coordination inside U.S. headquarters structures, and limiting the likelihood that temporary command transfers of the kind seen during the Bulge would recur without necessity. This gradual recalibration of authority did not remove Montgomery from influence, but it subtly narrowed the diplomatic space in which he operated. From a broader, educational angle, this sequence of events helps illustrate how leadership decisions in wartime often function through quiet structural adjustments rather than loud or symbolic confrontations. Historians studying World War II frequently emphasize that the coalition's success depended on Eisenhower's ability to absorb controversy, redirect energy, and maintain the collective focus on final victory rather than personal or institutional pride. Montgomery's experience after January 1945 thus becomes a case study in how coalition leaders navigated personality conflicts without fracturing strategic unity. In the months that followed, Montgomery continued to command major Allied operations as his forces crossed the Rhine and advanced into northern Germany. His army group played a decisive role in clearing the Netherlands, capturing key port regions, and pushing into German territory as Nazi resistance collapsed. Yet even in success, the legacy of the January Press episode lingered in Allied memory. American leaders remained wary of moments where strategic communication might appear to privilege national recognition over shared responsibility. As a result, public narratives about final victory in Western Europe increasingly emphasized collective Allied effort, a posture that both preserved unity and reflected the overwhelming scale of American logistical and military contribution during the war's closing chapter. From a historical learning perspective, Montgomery's experience provides valuable insight into how power, leadership, and perception evolve in coalition environments. It reveals that even highly capable commanders must adapt to political contexts, and that reputation itself becomes a strategic instrument capable of shaping opportunity, influence, and trust. Students examining this episode gain a deeper understanding of how the final months of World War II were not a simple linear march toward victory, but a complex process shaped by interpersonal negotiation, strategic compromise, and constant recalibration of authority across national boundaries. Another important layer of analysis concerns how historians themselves have interpreted Montgomery's wartime behavior and the January 1945 incident across subsequent decades. Early post-war British narratives often portrayed him as a disciplined and methodical commander whose confidence was misread by American observers unfamiliar with his communication style. Later scholarship adopted a more nuanced framework, acknowledging both his significant operational achievements and the ways in which his assertiveness sometimes strained coalition unity. American historians, meanwhile, tended to view the press conference as emblematic of broader tensions in Anglo-American cooperation, though more recent academic writing has emphasized structural and institutional context rather than personal rivalry alone. This evolving historiography offers educational value by demonstrating how historical interpretation changes over time. As new archival materials became available and political sensitivities diminished, scholars were able to reassess wartime dynamics with greater distance and analytical flexibility. In this sense, Montgomery's press controversy serves as a reminder that history is not static. It is continually re-examined through new frameworks, methods, and perspectives. The post-war legacy of the incident also shaped Montgomery's later public life. In his memoirs, he defended his actions and interpretations, arguing that his intention had always been to preserve order during crisis and to present an accurate account of events as he had experienced them. His critics remained unconvinced, believing that even if his motives were not malicious, the political consequences were nonetheless significant. This debate continues to animate discussions about his leadership today, making the episode an enduring case study in the intersections of personality, authority, and coalition military strategy during World War II. As the Allied forces continued advancing through Germany in the spring of 1945, the subtle aftershocks of the January press controversy remained present in strategic discussions and internal correspondence. While the focus of military operations shifted toward final offensives and occupation planning, the perceptions formed during that moment continued to shape how British and American leaders evaluated Montgomery's proposals and weighed his recommendations against those of other senior commanders. From an educational perspective, this phase of World War II illustrates how a single public event could echo across broader structural relationships, influencing how ideas were received and how strategic authority was distributed in the closing months of the conflict. The Allied High Command now faced two simultaneous challenges: defeating the remaining German resistance and preparing for the political and logistical complexities of post-war Europe. Eisenhower's broad front strategy, reinforced by American numerical and material dominance, increasingly defined operational direction. Montgomery's role, though significant, was now framed within a more rigid command architecture that left less room for improvisational leadership assertions or high-visibility strategic debate. He continued to advocate strongly for operational coherence and casualty conservation, emphasizing discipline and measured advance, but his influence was mediated through a diplomatic filter shaped by earlier tensions. This demonstrated how coalition leadership was not only a matter of formal hierarchy, but also of accumulated trust and political memory. From a historical analysis standpoint, this dynamic offers insight into a fundamental principle of coalition warfare. Authority is exercised not only through rank, but through credibility, perception, and the willingness of partners to accept one another's judgment. Montgomery's January press remarks had not eliminated his credibility, but they had complicated it, especially among American commanders who already sensed an imbalance in how wartime achievements were being publicly narrated. The incident served as a symbolic threshold where strategic legitimacy began to shift decisively toward the American command sphere, reflecting the broader geopolitical transition from British pre-war influence to emerging U.S. post-war dominance. Educationally, this transition provides a valuable framework for understanding the end of World War II as both a military conclusion and a historical turning point in global power alignment. Britain entered the war as a principal global empire with deep strategic authority, but emerged financially strained and increasingly dependent on American support. The United States, by contrast, emerged with unmatched industrial capability, expanding geopolitical reach, and a growing role in European security planning. Montgomery's diminishing latitude within Allied decision-making mirrored this larger structural transformation, symbolizing the shift from British-centered command tradition toward a new era of American strategic leadership. At the same time, it is important for students and viewers to recognize that this shift did not erase British contributions or undermine Montgomery's operational value. His troops continued to play an essential role in key northern operations, including securing ports, bridging the Rhine, and managing prisoner surrender zones. British logistical expertise, combat endurance, and organizational discipline contributed significantly to the stabilization of liberated territories. However, as the war neared its end, the symbolic importance of wartime narratives intensified. Every public statement, historical account, or post-war memoir became part of a broader struggle over how the war would be remembered and whose leadership would be celebrated most prominently. This raises an important educational question about how historical legacy is constructed. Did the controversy surrounding Montgomery's press conference reflect objective strategic reality, or did it reveal how personal communication style can overshadow complex operational truth? Historians examining this question often emphasize that the incident was not simply about ego, but about competing visions of how leadership should be publicly articulated. Montgomery believed that firm, confident narrative presentation strengthened morale and clarified strategic direction. Many American leaders believed instead that public messaging should emphasize collective unity and institutional modesty. These contrasting approaches to wartime communication reveal deeper differences in national political culture, military tradition, and public expectation. In the decades following World War II, memoirs, biographies, and academic studies continued to revisit this episode as a case study in coalition friction. British accounts often highlighted Montgomery's deliberate planning and his contribution to stabilizing the Ardennes front. American accounts tended to stress the importance of cooperative humility and the perception that Montgomery's remarks risked damaging the trust on which Allied success depended. Over time, newer scholarship has moved beyond polarized national interpretations, framing the controversy within a broader understanding of how alliances function under pressure and how human personality shapes institutional behavior. From a teaching standpoint, this historiographical evolution demonstrates why critical analysis is essential when studying major conflicts like World War II. Events such as Montgomery's press conference should not be viewed as isolated missteps or dramatic confrontations, but as windows into larger systems of power, identity, and decision-making. They reveal how war leadership extends far beyond tactics or battlefield movement, encompassing diplomacy, narrative construction, and the careful management of multinational relationships. Another instructive dimension concerns how Montgomery himself interpreted the episode in his later reflections. In his writings and public commentary, he often defended his words as factual and justified, emphasizing his belief that leadership required clarity, confidence, and directness. He viewed criticism as rooted in misinterpretation rather than intent. This personal perspective underscores the complexity of evaluating historical decision-making. Leaders act within the limits of their experiences, cultural expectations, and institutional environments. While hindsight allows historians to assess consequences, it is equally important to understand how actions appeared to those making decisions in real time. Educationally, this invites deeper reflection on leadership analysis. Students of history are encouraged not simply to categorize figures as right or wrong, cautious or egotistical, but to examine how different styles of leadership generate different forms of risk and benefit. Montgomery's confidence contributed to organizational morale and discipline, yet carried communication risks in multinational environments. Eisenhower's diplomatic restraint preserved coalition unity, yet sometimes required accepting internal tensions rather than confronting them publicly. Both approaches were shaped by necessity, circumstance, and broader strategic objectives. As the war concluded in May 1945 and Europe moved toward reconstruction, the operational disputes of the final campaign gradually transformed into matters of historical interpretation and political remembrance. The narrative of Allied victory became foundational to post-war identity in both Britain and the United States, and debates over credit, leadership, and strategic insight continued to surface in public discourse. Montgomery's press episode endured as a symbolic marker, a moment when the limits of personal ambition within coalition warfare became visible, and when the balance between individual recognition and collective unity was tested under global scrutiny. From an educational perspective, this story reinforces one of the most important lessons of World War II history. Success in multinational war efforts requires not only military capability, but also humility, restraint, and constant awareness of the broader political context in which decisions are communicated. Montgomery's experience illustrates how leadership reputation can become both a powerful asset and a potential vulnerability, depending on how it interacts with alliance expectations and public perception. In the broader study of modern history, this episode remains relevant beyond its wartime setting. Contemporary international coalitions, peacekeeping missions, and multinational military operations continue to grapple with similar challenges, reconciling national pride with cooperative responsibility, balancing assertive leadership with diplomatic sensitivity, and ensuring that public communication strengthens rather than undermines strategic relationships. The lessons drawn from Montgomery's press controversy offer enduring insight into these continuing dynamics, making the event not merely a story of one commander's miscalculated message, but a deeper reflection on the nature of shared power in times of global crisis.